All right. So, for our first question this morning, after his resurrection, why did Jesus tell Mary not to touch him, but later told Thomas to touch him? Now, to give you reference on this starts in John chapter 20. Both of these events happen in John 20. So in John 20, beginning in verse number 15, it says, Jesus saith unto her, Woman, why weepest thou? Whom seekest thou? And she, supposing him to be a gardener, saith unto him, Sir, if thou hast borne him hence, tell me where thou hast laid him, and I will take him away. And Jesus saith unto her, Mary. And she turned herself and saith unto him, Rabboni, which is to say, Master. And Jesus saith unto her, Touch me not, for I am not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say unto them, I ascend unto my Father and your Father, and to my God and to your God. And Mary Magdalene came and told the disciples that she had seen the Lord, and that he had spoken these things unto her. So that's his conversation with Mary following his resurrection. In verse 25, it says, The other disciples therefore said to him being Thomas, We have seen the Lord. But he said unto them, Except I shall see his hands in the print of his nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe. And after 8 days, again the disciples were within, and Thomas with them. Then came Jesus, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst, and said, Peace be unto you. Then he said to Thomas, Reach hither thy finger, and behold my hands, and reach hither thy hand, and thrust it into my side, and be not faithless, but believing. And Thomas answered and said unto him, My Lord and my God. So on the surface, it seems that you have these contradictory issues that come up, these contradictory commands, especially when you look at it in the King James, which is what I just read from, is the King James Version. Now, here's where we're going to get a little bit complicated on here, but this is important to understand when you read the Bible. The Bible was written in 3 different languages. It was written in Hebrew, which is the vast majority of the Old Testament. It was written in Aramaic. The book of Daniel was written in Aramaic, not in Hebrew. And it was written in Greek, which is the New Testament. Most Bibles, when you get your Bible, if you go to the store and you buy a Bible, or you look at your Bible that you have, they came to you into the English in one of 3 different ways. There is what is known as the word-for-word translation. And basically what this is when it was taken from that original language and brought into English, they looked at each word in Hebrew and each word in Aramaic and each word in Greek, and they translated each word, and then they kind of restructured and adjusted for English grammar out of the grammar of the original language, because not all languages, even today, use the same sentence structure. For instance, most Latin languages, Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, the way they construct a sentence is different from how we construct it in English. And so if you do a direct word-for-word translation from that language, you a lot of times have to turn things around and adjust for where the verbs are and where the nouns are and things like that. But basically, that's what the word-for-word translation did. It takes each word, translates it into English, makes some minor adjustments. In the King James, you'll also see some words that are italicized. Those are not italicized to draw attention to those words. They're italicized to let you know that those words are not in the original transcripts. And they were added in for clarity's sake, so that you can understand. The second way in which they translate is what is referred to as a thought for thought. And basically what in the thought for thought translation is they sit down, they say, well, this is the general concept of the sentence, of the paragraph, of the verse, or whatever, and they try to translate that general thought into English. And then the last thing that you're going to find is a modernization or a paraphrase. These are not actually translations. Basically what they are is they take an English version and they attempt to simplify it. And so you'll have different Bibles like the Message, these are paraphrases. They're not a translation of any sort. So, the King James Version, the English Standard Version, and the Holman Christian Standard Bible, that's why if you pay attention in the messages and things like that, whenever I put up the scripture on the screen, you'll see at the end of that, you'll see the reference as to what version I'm using. ESV, KJV, HCSB. Those three are all word-for-word translations, and to be perfectly honest, word-for-word translations are the best on the market. And the reason why that they're the best is simply because they are translated word for word. And in each case, in all of those, even going back to 1611 with the King James, what they did is they got a bunch of scholars together and they had them sit down and they would translate, and they would all have to agree or at least get a majority vote on, yes, this is the best way of translating this word. And so you would have kind of this consensus of scholars, but they would not be putting their opinion. The thought for thought translation and the modernization or the paraphrase are weaker simply because you run the risk, and you do actually have this happen, in which a person's personal opinion and personal views can easily take root in what is being placed there. That's why that's why I use one of those three whenever I teach or preach, is because they are word for word, and word for word is just going to be the most accurate that you're going to find. Now, why all of this matters? Because what you read in the English may not, especially in 2026, may not carry the same meaning that was in the original Greek or Hebrew or Aramaic. There might be a different thought there than what you're actually seeing. So in this particular case, when Jesus told Mary not to touch him, that's not what he actually said. So, here's your Greek lesson. I know, we all love these. But the word that the King James translates as touch is the Greek word haptomai. And this does not mean, touch, poke, whatever. The word actually means to cling to or to be glued to. So what was actually happening, and by the way, in both the English Standard and Holman Christian Standard, that's actually how they translate it as cling in both of those translations. And that actually tells you what is actually happening, because it wasn't that Mary was standing 15 feet away from Jesus and turns around and says Rabboni. What actually happened is she fell on her face and she grabbed a hold of him. Either grasped him by the feet and was holding onto his feet, or she wrapped her arms around his legs and wouldn't let go. She was clinging to him. She was glued to him. And when you actually look, Jesus, what he tells her is don't cling to me like this. You need to let me go. Why? For two very simple reasons. Number one, he had a job for Mary to do, which was to go back and tell the disciples. She couldn't stay there in the garden all day holding on to Jesus. She had a mission. Jesus also had other people that he was going to be appearing to and speaking to that day. So he wasn't rebuking her. He wasn't saying, don't put your hands on me. He was disentangling himself from her. Now, in the case of Thomas said, I want to touch the nail prints. I want to put my hand in his side. Jesus, in that case, he was inviting Thomas to examine and to see the proof, see the evidence that he was really who he said he was. Which is, again, very consistent when you actually look at the ministry of Jesus. Jesus oftentimes invited people Look at the evidence, look at the miracles I've performed, look at what I've done. Now, interestingly, we're not told that Thomas actually had to do any of that. The appearance of Jesus seems to have been sufficient to convince Thomas because he immediately says, "My Lord and my God." So but here's where this becomes a more important issue than just a general question of curiosity. Because word-for-word translations are the best. They're going to be the most accurate. But again, you take the King James, which was originally translated in 1611. The English language today is nothing like it was in 1611. It changes constantly. My word, there are words in the English language today that 10 years ago didn't exist. It is a language constantly changes and alters, and the words that the translators used at the time don't necessarily always reflect the deeper meaning of what's being said here. That's what the case is here. It is simply a matter of having to go in and dig for the deeper meaning. So, this is where, for a Bible study tool, a good concordance comes into play. You do not have to be a Greek, Hebrew, or Aramaic scholar to do this. If you go in and you get yourself a good concordance like Strong's Concordance, which has every word in the Bible, even in most of your Bibles, in the back, in those portions before you get to the maps, there's generally a concordance there. It's a limited concordance, but there is a concordance there. And you can look and you can go in and start to see what some of these words mean, and you can start to kind of get the idea, okay, well, this is not necessarily what I thought it meant when you actually understand the language. And so in this question, the answer is relatively simple. He was telling Mary, let go of me. I got other things to do and you got things to do. Whereas Thomas, he's saying, check for yourself, see for yourself. That's what's happening there. Again, answer is very simple, but it opens us into a deeper understanding that we need to be willing to spend a little bit more time than just reading what's on the surface and actually study and use some of the tools that are available for us out there. And by the way, you can find all sorts of concordances and Bible study tools absolutely free on the internet. You have all sorts of things like that out there. The second question that we're going to look at today, it was actually longer than what I've put on here, but I've kind of basically boiled it down very simply. Explain the Ark of the Covenant. So, in Exodus 25, God commanded the construction of the Ark. And the Ark of the Covenant is basically a box. It is a box that was made out of wood, and then it was plated with gold. It had, on each of the corners of the box, it had a golden ring through which a gold-plated pole would be placed through so they could carry the Ark of the Covenant. The lid of it which is known as the mercy seat, it was made out of solid gold, and it had two cherubim that faced one another, two angels that faced one another, with their wings that were raised up and met in the middle. So, kind of an idea of this. Overall, the length and the width of it were very similar to the size of the communion table here. It just was about 2/3 the height. It wasn't as tall as the communion table. Roughly, its length and width were about this size. In terms of additional concerning it, only the Levites were permitted to carry the ark, and they were only permitted to carry it via the poles the carrying poles, and only the priests were ever allowed to, only the high priest really was ever allowed to come into direct contact with the ark. But even when it was carried, it was always kept covered. Now, initially, because it's a box, things were kept inside the box. We are told specifically that there were 3 things that were kept inside the box. There was the original stone tablets that Moses brought down off the mountain, from Mount Sinai. There was Aaron's rod that budded, and there was also a golden pot that contained manna. In fact, in the book of Hebrews, chapter 9, verses 2 through 4, the writer of Hebrews talks about this, and you can see this in other places as well. He says, "For the tabernacle was set up, and in the first room, which is called the holy place, where the lampstand, the table, and the presentation loaves, behind the second curtain, the tabernacle of the tabernacle was called the most holy place. It contained the gold altar of incense and the ark of the covenant, covered with gold on all sides, and in which there was a gold jar containing manna, Aaron's staff that budded, and the tablets of the covenant." So, the other thing that we see is the Ark of the Covenant was kept within what was referred to as the Holy of Holies. So in the tabernacle was split up basically into 2 rooms. The temple was built following that same design. It was basically split into 2 rooms. You had the larger room, which was known as the holy place. The second room that was separated by a curtain, that was known as the Holy of Holies. And the Ark of the Covenant was to be kept within the Holy of Holies. So as long as the Jewish people, even during the time of the Exodus, as long as they were camped, the Ark of the Covenant stayed in the Holy of Holies. If they moved, then it would be covered and it would be taken out when they collapsed down the tent and carried it on. When they built the temple, the Ark of the Covenant was placed within the Holy of Holies and it stayed there. And again, it always had to be kept covered. It was only carried by the Levites. Now, here's what's important to understand about the Ark of the Covenant. It was a representation of the presence of God. In the Jewish mind, it served as the throne of God on earth. So the lid was called the mercy seat, and yes, I mean, if you think about it, again, about 2/3 the size of the height of this table here, and you have the angel wings that basically serve as a backrest. It's perfect height for its chair when you have the mercy seat on it. And so they viewed it as God's throne on earth. Keep that in mind. We'll talk about that more in a moment. But in the years of the conquest of the Promised Land and some years after the establishment of it, the Ark of the Covenant was used in the conquest of the Promised Land. And what they would do is they would carry it into battle. And basically, the reason they would do this is, first of all, during a conquest, this was commanded by God, but the reason why they continued to do it for some time was because they said, well, the ark represents the presence of God, and if we bring the ark with us, then that means that God is going to be with us in this battle, and He will fight for us in this battle. That's why they would bring it into battle with them. Now, when you look at it, there's a lot of miracles that are associated with the presence of the ark. In Joshua chapter 3, verses 14 through 16, about to go into the conquest, it says, when the people broke camp across the Jordan, the priests carried the Ark of the Covenant ahead of the people. Now the Jordan overflows its banks throughout the harvest season, but as soon as the priests carrying the Ark reached the Jordan, their feet touched the water at its edge, and the water flowing downstream stood still, rising up in a mass that extended as far as Adam, a city next to Zarethan. And the water flowing downstream into the Sea of Arabah, the Dead Sea, was completely cut off, and the people crossed opposite to Jericho. So you see these miracles, and this is just one of them. There are other miracles that happen that are related to the presence of the ark, but the simple possession of the ark did not grant any particular powers. And the reason why is very simple. Because the Ark of the Covenant had no powers. It was a wooden box plated in gold with a golden lid. That's it. The Ark of the Covenant had no powers. And like I said, just mere possession of the Ark did not necessarily bring any benefits. In 1 Samuel chapter 4, Israel carries the Ark of the Covenant into battle against the Philistines, and Israel loses the battle. If the Ark had powers to give them victory in that, then why didn't the Ark do it? Because the Ark has no power. And what happens is the Philistines capture the Ark in that battle. In the next chapter, the Philistines take it back home. They put it in the temple of Dagon. And the next morning, they go into the temple, and the idol of Dagon has collapsed and has been destroyed. And then people start getting cancerous tumors all through the city. And so they say, we need to get rid of this thing. And they send it over to the city of Gath. And the same thing happens in Gath. And the Philistines there say, okay, we need to get rid of this thing. And so they send it back to the nearest Jewish settlement, which is basically a farm where it stays there for a time being. But they sent it back out of fear. But what's happened is a lot of people misunderstand the Ark of the Covenant because of popular culture. Because of movies like Raiders of the Lost Ark and other media, the Ark of the Covenant is often viewed as some sort of magical, mystical object that has all of these great powers, and if you just master the powers, then you would have all sorts of powers to it. But the Ark doesn't have any power. All of the miracles performed that happened in relationship to the Ark were acts that God did. The Ark is simply representative of God's presence. It is always God who does that. It was holy. The Ark of the Covenant was holy because God's presence made it so. And disrespecting the Ark was tantamount to disrespecting God. That's why if a person touched the Ark of the Covenant and they weren't supposed to, they broke the rules, they would be struck dead. Not because the Ark had any powers, but because that was disrespecting God. And God would strike the person dead for disrespecting Him. So that's the nature of it. It was placed in the tabernacle and later in the temple behind the curtain of the Holy of Holies, and only one person a year was permitted, once it was established, only one person on one day a year was ever permitted into the Holy of Holies, into the presence of the Ark, and that was the high priest. This is laid out in Leviticus chapter 16 as we are told about the Day of Atonement. Only the high priest could enter, only on one day a year, and if he did not do everything right in approaching that ark, he would be struck dead. This is why part of the reason when you actually read about the priestly robes, this is why the high priest on the bottom of his robe had bells. Because if he went into the Holy of Holies and he gets struck dead, how are you going to know that he got struck dead? Because only he's allowed in there. So if those bells stopped ringing, they would know, worst has happened. He would also go in there with a rope tied around his ankle in case he got struck dead. Because again, no one else is allowed in there, and you can't leave the dead body of the former high priest in there. So they would tie the rope around his ankle to drag his body out if he was struck dead. But what's important about the ark, dealing with the Old Testament, is that it is a picture. It is an image. It is a picture of what Christ did in shedding his own blood. This is seen in the book of Hebrews chapter 9. The Ark of the Covenant was picturing, in fact, all of the Old Testament law, everything about it was designed to picture Jesus Christ and what Jesus Christ would do and does do. And this brings us to the other issue why the Ark is so popular, because it disappeared. No one knows what happened to it. In fact, even the Bible goes completely silent on the issue of the Ark of the Covenant. Essentially what happens is we're told about the Ark of the Covenant from the time it was constructed in Exodus 25 through the time of the Exodus, through the wandering of the wilderness for those 40 years, through the conquest, through the early ages of the nation of Israel into the kingdom age, when Solomon builds the temple, we're told about how the ark was brought there. We're told all of these things, and then you come to the year 586 BC. One of two very, very important dates to know when it comes to the Old Testament is 586 BC. The other one is 722 BC. 722 is earlier than 586. In 722 BC, the northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians. In 586 BC, the southern kingdom was conquered by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. And at that point in time, after the conquest of the southern kingdom, after the southern kingdom is conquered by Nebuchadnezzar, the Bible is completely silent about the Ark of the Covenant. It's not mentioned again in the Old Testament. And in the New Testament, it is only referenced in the book of Hebrews in relationship to its position in the law. And it is referenced again in the book of Revelation, which I'll talk about here in a second. But it's just, the Bible goes completely silent about it. And no one actually knows what happens. There's no further mention of the ark. It's interesting because 70 years after the southern kingdom falls, when the Babylonian Empire also falls and Cyrus becomes the emperor, he allows the Jews to return back to Israel, back to the Promised Land, to rebuild the temple. And he gave them back all of the temple treasures that had been taken by Nebuchadnezzar. But in that list of the temple treasures that were given back, the Ark of the Covenant is never mentioned. It's not described when in the New Testament, when the veil is torn, when Jesus dies on Calvary's cross, and the veil is torn from the top to the bottom. There were priests who were present. This is how we know what happened, because there were priests who were present there who watched the event occur. They did not report as having seen the Ark of the Covenant in that temple. There is no reference to it. In 70 AD, the Romans sacked the city of Jerusalem and they destroyed the temple and they carried away the temple treasures. The Romans do not list the Ark of the Covenant as having been taken at that time. In fact, there is an object, or there's what is known as the Arch of Titus. It's in Rome. Titus was the Roman general who sacked the city of Jerusalem. The Arch of Titus, it's an arch in Rome that commemorates the victory that Titus had there, and it shows his soldiers carrying temple treasures with them back to Rome. But the Ark of the Covenant, which you would think would be so important, is not pictured on the arch. The Ark of the Covenant just disappears. So this raises the question, what happened to it? There are three possible explanations that are given. The first is that God translated the ark to heaven. In other words, he took it off of this earth and took it to heaven. It's based largely from Revelation 11 and verse 19. I told you this is the other place that the Ark of the Covenant is talked about in the New Testament. But in Revelation 11:19 it says, God's sanctuary in heaven was opened, and the Ark of his covenant appeared in his sanctuary, and there were flashes of lightning and rumbling of thunder and earthquake and severe hail. So the idea of this is that God took the physical ark before the Babylonian invasion, usually, and took it to heaven. There is a problem with that theory, though. Because in both Exodus, in the book of Exodus, and in the book of Hebrews, we are told that that the instructions to Moses were to build the tabernacle, all of its instruments, including the ark, to build it based off the pattern of what is in heaven. So what happened is Moses was shown what exists in heaven, in the heavenly tabernacle, including the heavenly ark, and he took that image that God revealed to him, and he based the construction of the earthly ark off of that. So there is a heavenly ark, and there is an earthly ark. So why in the world would God need to take the earthly ark out of this earth and take it to heaven? Kind of pointless. So that's the big problem with that first idea. The second idea was that the Ark of the Covenant was destroyed by either Nebuchadnezzar or by Titus. It was either destroyed in 586 BC or in 70 AD. Now again, it comes down, it's based on the fact that the presence of the Ark is not listed after the Babylonian invasion. And that, again, because the Ark of the Covenant, its ultimate purpose was to reveal the work of Jesus Christ, then it ceased to be necessary. And so it just becomes an earthly object made of gold. We know that in 70 AD, when Titus invaded the city of Jerusalem and he sacked the city of Jerusalem, he destroyed the temple there, that someone, there's questions as to who did it, whether it was the Romans or whether it was the Jews, somehow the temple got set on fire. And that temple had a massive amount of gold in it because what Herod the Great did when he did a renovation of it. And that fire, of course, gold has a very, very low melting point. And when that fire broke out, a lot of the gold that was kept in the temple complex melted. And to get all of that gold, they actually were taking the rocks apart, or taking the stone blocks down piece by piece to get the gold off the vat that had melted. So the idea is that perhaps it was destroyed in that. This is possible, but it's unlikely. And part of the reason that we say that is because, again, going back to the Arch of Titus, the Arch of Titus does picture the golden lampstand. Now, there is a problem with that. The Arch of Titus shows the golden lampstand being carried by Roman soldiers, and it shows that it had a hexagonal base. The actual lampstand that was in the temple had a three-leg base. So what was shown on the Arch of Titus could not be the original golden lampstand. But that doesn't mean that some of the objects taken from the temple and were taken out before the destruction of the temple, that doesn't mean that the Romans did not take some of those temple treasures. But we do know that Herod made copies because, again, let me kind of give you a little background on the history of the temple. First temple was built by Solomon. David had the idea, he had the vision for it, he started collecting the materials for it. He was not permitted to build the temple. Solomon, his son, is the one who builds the temple. That's the first temple. That one was destroyed in 586 by Nebuchadnezzar, when Nebuchadnezzar conquered the southern kingdom. The second temple was built after Cyrus, 70 years after the Babylonian invasion, Cyrus allows the Jews to return. And at that point in time, they rebuild the temple. That is actually laid out. That story is in the book of Ezra. That's what the book of Ezra is about, largely, is the rebuilding of the temple. And that temple was very, very small and kind of, by comparison to Solomon's temple, it was kind of pathetic. But they were dirt poor people, and they did the best that they could. When, after the Roman invasion, the Romans conquered the land, Herod the Great, this is the guy that you read about in Luke chapter 2 and Matthew chapter 2, who tried to kill Jesus as an infant. Herod the Great did a renovation project. He expanded the temple tremendously, brought in all sorts of wealth, all sorts of gold, and in the course of that, he made duplicates or made additional temple treasures. That is likely what is pictured on the Arch of Titus, is those extras, those replicas that Herod had made. And that brings us to the third possibility about what happened to the ark. And not just the ark, but the other original temple treasures that were constructed by Moses in the last part of Exodus. And that is that they were moved and hidden. This is based on the idea that you would still have faithful priests who were serving, and they would recognize the threat of destruction that was coming with the Babylonians. It had been laid out in prophecy that they were going to come and they were going to destroy. And knowing that that would happen, they would take those temple treasures and hide them and conceal them so that the Babylonians could not take them. And what the Babylonians took, and then later the Romans took, were replicas, were backups. Now, this is where the idea and the belief that the Ark of the Covenant is currently in Ethiopia comes from. Although, to be perfectly, that one, when you actually start looking at it and examining it according to what the Bible teaches, there is no way that the Ark of the Covenant is in Ethiopia. That is not the Ark of the Covenant that is there, that they claim to be there. What is the most likely conclusion is that the Ark of the Covenant, the temple treasures, and even the original tabernacle were all concealed in secret chambers underneath the Temple Mount. And it is well known and well proven that there are numerous hidden tunnels underneath the Temple Mount. But they can't excavate any of those because of the Dome of the Rock, which now sits on the Temple Mount. Because if they tried to excavate under the Temple Mount, the Islamists there would go crazy and start a murdering spree, basically. So at the moment, they can't excavate under the Temple Mount, but that is the most likely location of where the temple treasures are. In addition, there are these things known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. You've probably heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls was a very unique scroll. Unlike the others, which were made largely on animal skins, there was one of them that was made out of copper. And the copper scroll, they actually, for a long time, they couldn't get it open because of the corrosion on it. And then they figured out how to basically cut off little pieces of it, and they've since been able to lay it out and read the copper scroll. The copper scroll dates back to the 1st century. And it details and talks about how there is this treasure that exists. It doesn't describe everything, but it tells us that this treasure is made out of gold and silver, and that in today's market, it would be worth somewhere in the neighborhood of about $20-25 billion. and that it has been hidden. It was hidden in the first century because of Roman aggression. A lot of scholars believe that that treasure that is described there is likely the temple treasures, and that they were hidden and concealed before the destruction of the temple by Titus in 70 AD. The last option is the most probable, but, and this is a big but, the Bible doesn't say. The Bible is very quiet. It is silent on what actually happened to the ark. No one actually knows what happened to the ark. God knows, but no one else does. However, I told you a moment ago that the Ark of the Covenant was viewed as God's throne on earth. When you look at the furniture that existed within the tabernacle and later the temple, you walk in the temple. When you walked in the main doors, to your right would be the table of showbread. To your left would be the golden menorah, the golden lampstand. Directly in front of you was the altar of incense. Behind that, the curtain that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies was right behind the altar of incense, and right behind that, in that Holy of Holies, was the Ark of the Covenant. There were no seats in the temple or in the tabernacle. There was nowhere to sit except for the mercy seat. I want you to look at this verse from the book of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 4. It says, he, and this is talking about Antichrist, he opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he sits in God's sanctuary, publicizing that he himself is God. So basically what Paul is telling us is in the tribulation period, during the tribulation, this is laid out in prophecy, that a third temple will be built. And Paul tells us that the Antichrist will go into that temple and sit, proclaiming himself to be God. So the question is, where is he sitting? There's only one place to sit in the temple. Many people, many Bible scholars, this is my opinion. Again, my opinion. Take that for what it's worth. My opinion is that the temple treasures have been hidden. That either at the beginning or just prior to the tribulation period, those temple treasures will be discovered. And when the new temple is built, that they will be placed inside. And once they're inside, Antichrist will go in and proclaim himself as God. And he will sit on the mercy seat, proclaiming himself as God. Now again, part of that is absolutely true. The part about the temple treasures being discovered, that's my opinion. I think that they still exist. I think they're still hidden within the land, most likely under the Temple Mount. I think that's the best argument for it. But in the end, I don't know, and only God does.